In this video, we are going to explore monetary and fiscal policy, which refer to the two most widely recognized tools to influence a nation's economic activity. First, we have fiscal policy, and fiscal policy is what the government does to work on the economy, and essentially, it has three main tools that it can use: taxes, spending, and the issue of government debt. So, pretty much, fiscal policy is the use of tax spending and debt to control or influence the state of the economy. So, now what is monetary policy? Monetary policy is also used by the government, but it is used by a certain branch of the government, which really isn't a branch of the government. So, what I'm talking about is called the Federal Reserve, otherwise known as the Fed. Here's the thing about the Federal Reserves: the chairman and the 12 governors of the Federal Reserve are appointed by Congress, and the Federal Reserve itself is overseen by Congress. But the Federal Reserve is much more independent. It's not a branch of government like the Treasury is. It is very independent, and it can use all the tools it has as it likes. And all it has to do is check into Congress every now and again. So what does the Fed have in its toolbox to influence the economy and the monetary policy? It has a few things. The first thing being interest rates. If they have a target rate, they want banks to lend out a certain rate that can influence how much money goes in and out of the banks. The next thing is the money supply, which is called open market operations, and that is when the Fed goes out and buys debt, buys treasuries from the banks. The more treasuries it buys, the more money that goes into the banks, and the banks will lend out. The next thing is the use of a discount window. The discount window is where the banks go to borrow from the Federal Reserve. Depending on what the rate of the discount window, the banks will be able to borrow more or less, or hopefully be able to lend out more or less depending on the rate. The next thing is a currency peg, which they could use. This doesn't happen very often, and this is when the Fed might say we're going to peg our currency to another currency. And this method is kind of out there and happens very rarely. The next thing is reserve requirements. That is when the Fed requires the banks to park a certain amount of money at the Fed, so they get a bunch of assets or cash and they park them at the Fed. And what that does is it forces them to put a certain extra amount of money aside, and then it means they can't lend that money out. So that's another way of slowing down the economy.